Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Voices of Recovery. I'm your host, Michele Eich, and this is my book, How to Kill an Addiction, Recovery with God. In this book, I talk about how to break free by developing a relationship with God, and I also have 20 powerful testimonies of real people who have overcome with God's help, so I'd love it if you check it out. Every week, I interview somebody who has overcome a life-controlling issue, and this week, my guest is Cathy. Cathy, welcome to Voices of Recovery.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, Michele, and honored to have this time with you. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And if you would just introduce yourself to our audience, please.
Absolutely. Well, again, Cathy Studer. I am a certified speaker. I'm a darkness to light facilitator and honored to say award-winning author, which I never thought I would say before, but a calling for a purpose directed me to write this book. And it has been a journey, and I'm grateful, even though writing it and putting it out there, since it was such a personal story, was truly like standing naked in front of a bunch of people and letting them see your flaws. But here's what I do know. This book is about hope, it's about healing, and it's about change. And that's what we're going to talk about today, Michele. So thank you.
Absolutely. That was a great introduction. If you could just take a moment and hold your book up, Cathy. It is Broken to Beautifully Whole, a compelling crusade to break the silence, move through the trauma, and heal the pain. And I just love it. And you have my favorite color on there. But if you could just take a moment, Cathy, and explain what is significant about the picture on the front of the bowl.
It is very significant. So this is a bowl, and it is called kintsugi, which is a Japanese art. And that is a means to take something that has been broken and pull it back together piece by piece with lacquered silver or gold, because it comes with the philosophy that when something is broken, it can be pulled back together and made stronger and more beautifully whole. And the cracks and our scars are meant to be highlighted, not hidden, and a means of embracing our imperfections.
I love that. That is so good. And it reminds me of a scar. You mentioned that. And one of the things that I talk about when you look at a scar, you can say, well, this is where I was wounded. Everybody see, this is where I was wounded right here. There was a wound here. You know, you can focus on the wound, or you can say, this is where God healed me. And so I love how the cracks are highlighted, and the bowl is just a different kind of beauty than it was before it was cracked, right? It's not the same. It is different, but it's still beautiful.
Absolutely. And here's another cool attribute about kintsugi, which why it was the perfect metaphor for my own healing pilgrimage. So if you take that bowl before it was broken, that bowl had value and it had worth. Well, then it breaks. Well, now it's lost some of its value. Yet, if we mend it with the silver and gold, which is what we can do by certain attributes we add into our life, it's mended, and now it's worth more. Hear this, it's worth more than what it was before it was even broken.
Wow.
That is the gift of becoming kintsugi.
I love it. What a great metaphor for your story. Well, let's go ahead and jump in, Cathy. So your book is in several parts. We're going to talk about part one, Through the Child's Eyes, and this is basically an introduction to what happened to you. So if you would just take some time, you were a victim of childhood sexual abuse by your stepfather. We won't go into great detail because I really want to focus on the healing, and you also give some awesome tips on what parents can do and watch out for in protecting their children. But if you could just share whatever God places on your heart about what happened to you as a child.
So my abuse started when I was 6 years old, and my mom worked nights because she made more money. And so my stepfather, again, would come to my room in the middle of the night, took me downstairs, and it began. And at age 6, my innocence was stripped. My shame began. The cracks began. And unfortunately, the abuse continued for 6 years.
Wow.
And it was hard, and the shame grew. There
Mhm.
were many times when I wanted to tell, but what I really want people to take away is understand through the child's eyes why it's so hard, because the story we tell ourselves is, this must be my fault in some way. This must be happening to me because I'm bad. And unfortunately, my stepfather did tell me I was bad, and this is why this was happening to me. So you can only imagine the shame that a child begins to develop and grow and build upon when this keeps happening to them. And I had lost sleep. And it was hard. It was incredibly hard. And I lost a piece of myself.
Mhm.
And thank goodness it ended on a New Year's Eve night. I was 12 years old. I had gone to bed. And unbeknownst to me, my mom and my stepdad had an argument.
Mhm.
And after my stepfather left the bedroom, my mom had a sixth sense, or not a coincidence. This was a
Right.
God moment.
Yeah.
My mom had a sixth sense to look into my stepfather's wallet. And in his wallet, she found a letter that was written by myself, because when the abuse progressed, my stepfather would make me write what he was going to do to me. And unbeknownst to me, for his sick pleasure, he kept those in his wallet. Well, little did I know that that extreme extra piece of shame would be the catalyst to
Mhm.
end my nighttime nightmare. And my mom came and woke me up that night, and she looked me in the eye. And she, even though she already knew it was my writing, she asked me if it was my writing. I said yes. She said, "How long had this been going on?" And I said 6 years. And she grabbed me by my face and said, "This ends tonight." And we cried and hugged each other. And that night, my mom went downstairs and she kicked my stepfather out of that house.
Yeah.
And here's an important part. That night, my mom became my hero. That night, my mom reacted quickly, swiftly, appropriately, which is what I would only beg other parents to do. And I want people to hear this. Healing after sexual abuse is so hard. And it is a pilgrimage, not a journey. It's a pilgrimage.
Mhm.
Yet, it is so much easier when one person, just one,
Yeah.
willing to step up and be the hero. And that night, my mom became my hero, and I was forever grateful. There was still a lot of healing to be
Right.
had, but it was a gift.
Amen. Well, Cathy, you write about it so beautifully and just your memories. And we won't go into detail, but I recommend people get your book, and I will post the links to that after the interview. But yeah, it was very touching. I cried because you just were such a beautiful child, and yet you still persevered. You tried to keep an optimistic attitude, and your stepfather even said that your mom was in on this, and then you really questioned that, like, does my mom really know? Is she approving of this? I mean, this is just mental torture on top of physical torture and torment. It's just kind of mind-boggling. But I'm just so grateful that your mom, like you said, took swift action and was your hero. But then, even though that ended, you then began that healing pilgrimage that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, it took a long time, and that healing pilgrimage did not happen right away. It did not
Mhm.
happen in my teens. It did not happen in early adulthood. When I was in my teens, I did not pick good boyfriends.
Mhm.
I had poor coping choices, which
Right.
is so typical for those
Yes.
who suffer trauma, childhood trauma, especially, because we want to numb our pain. We don't want to move through it. We want to numb it because we just don't want to feel it because it hurts so bad. And for me, it took becoming pregnant with my son, my first child, and making a conscious choice that, oh my gosh, I need to be a better person so I can be a good parent. I want to be the best that I can be because this innocent child deserves that.
Right.
So I stepped and leaned hard into that healing pilgrimage. And it was messy. It came with setbacks.
Sure.
It came with pain. It came with tears. But I got there. It was long. I'm not going to lie. My healing pilgrimage was probably at least 20, 30 years, which is why I wrote my book,
Mhm.
because I want people to get there quicker than what I did. And one
Right.
of the other biggest reasons that I wrote my book, it started with a conversation with one of my clients. I'm a hairstylist by trade.
Mhm.
And I see clients every 4, 6, 8 weeks. And this client struggled horribly with depression and PTSD. And I had no idea why. And one day she shared the why. She too had been sexually abused as a child.
Mhm.
And we talked, and she asked me why I had not suffered to the degree that she had. Don't get me wrong, I had my issues,
Right.
but she was still suffering. And, you know, the conversation ended with her saying, "Girlfriend, you got to write a book."
Yeah.
And I walked away going, "What? Me? No, I'm not even a college graduate. I'm not going to write a book." But boy, that purpose and calling laid on me. And
Yes.
I did massive introspection, massive prayer, massive reflection, and research. And it
Yes.
ultimately came to, I have to write this. I have to write how and why some people do not suffer the mental health repercussions that are unfortunately so common
Yes.
after abuse.
Wow, that's powerful. Well, I'm so glad that that seed was planted because I think your book is helping a lot of people. And I do interview people quite often who have overcome childhood sexual abuse because, like you said, it's often the root of negative coping techniques like substance abuse, right? Like poor relationship
Absolutely.
choices. And so, you can put people in rehab and detox and do all the things, but until you get to that root, nothing's really going to change. And like you said, it is not easy, but neither is staying stuck. So, we've just got to continue to move forward. And one of the things that you said in there is the best way forward is through. I'm not quoting that exactly, but you've just got to get through it. And we just live in a world where we want to avoid things. We want to escape from reality and from the pain. We've got to get through it. But when God is there walking you through it, it really does change everything because you have that guide with you who can help you on the healing journey.
Well, it's strength. It's strength for us
Yes.
as we work through the healing journey. And for myself, I would learn that that was my resilience. That was my piece of strength as I got through it, what was almost unimaginable. And yeah, it's so important. And it's one of the attributes that I talk about in my book was my faith. And my faith was so hard, and it was not fast, and it was not easy because, again, as I said, my abuse happened for 6 years. And for
Right.
6 years, I laid in bed and I prayed for it to end. And even though it did finally end, I just kept asking why and how could a God not answer my prayers? Or how could he let this happen to other children? Or what most of us children think, does he think I'm bad too and deserve it?
Yes.
Because why else would this happen to me? And so I had all of those questions that I asked God over and over. And it was a long process, but a pilgrimage that I wanted to embark on and discover. And I personally, through my own faith journey, would ultimately learn that he was with me. He was there with me for the strength, for the resilience, so I could carry on. And then there again, to plant the seed
Right.
and the purpose when he knew I was ready to share, to help others.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and read an excerpt from the book, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but this is just such an important issue. And when I read those parts in the book, Cathy, about you praying to God that it would stop, and you praying when you went to bed that he wouldn't come in the room that night, I mean, that really got to me. And then when you said, maybe I'm bad and God thinks I'm bad too. I mean, these are heartbreaking. And the thing is that God's heart is broken, but he gives us choice and he gives other people choice. And we are oftentimes at the mercy of the choices people make, choices that people who are supposed to be protecting us, like a step parent. But this is what you wrote. My stepfather made some pretty bad choices that were destructive to me as a child. That was his free will. My own faith voyage has shown me I had the strength to survive because of the divine strength given to me and residing inside of me. Back to my questions as to why my prayers for the nighttime nightmare to stop were not being answered. I believe the pain and abuse could not be stopped as quickly as I so desperately wanted because of my stepfather's free will. However, the divine strength within allowed me to survive the abuse and truly carried me during the toughest part of my childhood. That is really powerful. And I think a lot of people end up being mad at God for not doing something. Now, God did intervene, the note and that your mother was prompted to look in that place, it did end. And that just really goes with a lot of our prayers, right? God's timing is not our timing. And part of the reason is because he has to work through people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly it. It was the free will that my stepfather had that created the hurt and the damage and the pain. But yet the strength given to me allowed me to endure, as I said, the divine strength. But yet it certainly didn't. I also want people to know that it does by no means condone his decision he made with free will, or does it excuse the choice that he made to hurt me through free will. It was just, this is why bad things happen in a world that God exists in, because he does give us free will.
Yes, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the statistics. You mentioned earlier that you did a lot of research for the book, and I really appreciate that because I think this is a guide for people who have suffered. And like I said, if you have a guide, if you have a mentor, if you have a Sherpa going alongside you on a journey, you're going to get to your destination faster. So these are the statistics you shared in the book. 48 million survivors of sexual abuse are living in the United States right now. 70% are under the age of 17. 1 in 4 girls under the age of 18 are sexually abused. 1 in 4 girls are sexually abused by the time they're 18, and 1 in 6 boys. 90% of abusers are people children know and trust. That was an eye opener for me, Cathy. Wow. And 85% of victims never report it.
Absolutely.
Staggering. Eye opening.
Well, so when you think of that number, go back to your number that you said 48 million. I want people to take that number and know that that's reported.
Yes.
So now let's add that 85% don't report. Now imagine that number again. Or another thing that I talk about, and like you said, you rolled through those statistics and they're really hard to hear, but they are our reality. Let's go to girls. 1 in 4 girls. Again, as you think about that number, now I want you to think about your daughter, your granddaughter, your nieces, your daughter's friends, your granddaughter's friends. Think of the girls in their class. Now reapply that number. That's a reality. And again, with boys, I had the honor one time to talk to a state highway patrol group in our local area. And there were a couple of males that hung back that wanted to talk to me afterwards. And one person shared with me that even though he was a state highway patrol, he said, I didn't want to believe those numbers when I first heard them. I just don't want to believe it. It just can't be true. I thought it can't be true. And then he stopped and he goes, oh my gosh, I'm a statistic. I pushed it down. I shoved it down. I kept it deep inside of me. And he had an incident with two other young boys. And he said it was pretty horrible. When I look back on that, now he said on a scale of 1 to 10, my incident would be lower on the scale versus he's had to go to cases where that number was very high on the scale. But he said, nonetheless, I didn't want to think I was, but I am.
Wow.
And the more we talk to other people, that number is very real. And also keep in mind, it is so much harder for men to share because of the masculinity issue or the ego issue of I should have been able to protect myself.
Right.
So, and here's another number that I don't believe I put in my book. It takes the average person, who's been sexually abused to age 52 to disclose.
Wow. Wow.
That's the average.
It really is. It's heart-wrenching. And yet in our society, there's this movement that wants to try to normalize all of this. And that's why we can't be silent. We have to continue to share our stories because it's not normal, it's not okay, and it needs to stop.
Absolutely. And in some ways, we're making very nice strides. We take 2 steps forward,
Right.
But in other ways, we take 2 steps back. Even right here, I'm just outside of Columbus, Ohio, and we had the incident with Dr. Strauss at OSU, the doctor who, oh my goodness, abused, at least we know on hand, at least 150 young men. And think of Dr. Strauss with OSU gymnastics. Think of Jerry Sandusky at Penn State.
Right.
Think of Jeffrey Epstein. In all of those cases that I just repeated, someone, if not 2 or more, reported early. Let me rephrase that. Let me repeat that. I'm sorry. People reported early. So we're talking 150 to 365 victims because Dr. Larry Nasser, they think, was up to 365. Imagine if we as a society respond. We don't want to step into it. We don't want to believe, or we put money, wins, and titles before the child or the survivor. So we really got to check our soul and our society and better respond and quicker respond. And that's our takeaway. We've got to figure out a way to truly listen, believe, and hear the survivor and the child, investigate and report and prosecute.
Yes.
If all of those cases, they would have been prosecuted, imagine how many less victims we would have had. But we've got to step into the conversations, and we have to believe and respond.
Absolutely. I agree with you wholeheartedly, Cathy. And it's something that even if you don't have children or grandchildren, that we need to share these messages out and do something, and not just talk about the problem or try to ignore the problem and pretend it's not happening.
Absolutely. And to go back to one of the statistics you said, you talked about 90% of the abusers or perpetrators of people they know. So I want everybody to think about that for half a second. Think of everybody that your child knows. So we're talking parents, step-parents, babysitters, coaches, pastors, any other contact. It could be a fellow friend, an older friend who has access to your child, which is why the conversations, and starting at a young age, as early as age 3, when children know their body parts, we need to start those conversations that you have body boundaries. These are your private parts, the parts that are covered by your underwear or your bathing suit. You can say say no. You have the right to say no. And if anybody, makes you feel uncomfortable, it's okay to tell. Please tell. You do not have to be uncomfortable. You don't have to feel shame. And even teaching children the difference between secrets and surprises. Surprises are good. Hey, having a birthday party for mommy. Secrets, don't tell anybody we did this. There is a difference. Surprises are good. Secrets are bad. And it's okay to tell a secret. And it's okay to be a tattletale. It is okay. So for so many years, don't be a tattletale. Don't be a tattletale.
Right.
Nobody wants to hang out with a tattletale. But in reality, we have to teach our children it's okay if anybody feels uncomfortable or could be getting hurt.
Absolutely. That's so good. And we're going to talk more about ways that you can prevent this when we get toward the end of the interview. Okay, so part 2 is one of my favorite parts, and that's a mess to a message. And that's really what I feel like is my story. That's what the stories are for Voices of Recovery, the original people who contributed to my book. And that's that beautiful gold, part of the gold that puts it back together, where God really redeems things and uses it for good instead of what the enemy is doing, using it for bad. So let's talk about how you feel like you have turned, or God has turned this mess, this what happened to you, into your message. Did it start with the conversation with your client when you were doing her hair?
It really did.
Yes.
I mean, I tell people in all honesty, if you would have told me 5 years ago, hey, Cathy, you're going to write a book and share your very private story with the world, I would have said, you're smoking something, because that is not happening.
Yes.
But it started the concept, it planted the seed. Yes. And then I went into, as I said, that reflection, introspection, and prayer and research. And I started to take notes and wrote them down on index cards. And I had this very unorganized pile of notes. And now what do I do? And I share in my book, I was invited to a talk at a United Way Women's Leadership Network group. And the person who was speaking that night was not talking about abuse, but sharing a message and what had happened to her. And that night I got the message loud and clear that it's time to tell my story. I have to put this out there. And I was so afraid to tell my story, so afraid, even though I was in a good place and I had healed and come so far. I had that tiny last piece of shame hanging on inside of me, afraid of what will people say? Will they judge me? Will they think less of me? Because that little child of you that was broken wants to be liked and loved so bad. And yet my message that night was powerful enough to tell me and remind me that, you know what? You're enough.
Yes.
It's time. Tell the story.
It's so good. And back to that statistic that 85% of people don't tell. And there's a difference between telling your pastor or telling your best friend or telling your sister than telling the world through your book.
Oh,
those are all steps in the process. And I know the first time I shared my story with some people that I trusted very much, it was incredibly freeing. I mean, I bawled most of the time, but once I walked out of that place, I felt so free. I felt this weight off of me. I don't know if you had a similar experience, but when you get to that point, I mean, I know it is not easy to get to that point, but once you do, it's like a load is off of you.
Well, it is. And scientifically, it creates a resolution in the brain. So it's the release in the brain, the trauma is stored in the brain, in our neural pathways. And when we say it out loud to someone, it starts to create that resolution. It starts to loosen up the impact of what that did to the brain. And I absolutely had that response. Again, even though I was in a good place, less than 10 people in the world knew my story before I talked about my book. In the very first place I talked about my book was at my church.
Mhm.
And I remember driving that day, and saying I was petrified is an understatement. I
Right.
was shaking. I was so scared. And I did it. It went incredibly well. The response was incredible.
Mhm.
And I remember driving home crying
Right.
because of the release. And again,
Yes.
I was in a good place, but still to have that
Yeah.
extra release, to say it that out loud,
Right.
was a whole different level. And it is. So I
Okay.
would want people to know that if anyone out there is hearing this and they haven't said it, find someone that you trust,
Mhm.
that you feel comfortable with, and share your story. It's a start. And again, it creates a resolution in the brain.
That's good. Well, especially when we're children, we think, well, no one else on the planet is having to go through what I'm going through. We feel that isolation and everything. And then once we start sharing, we realize we're not alone. Unfortunately, there are many people who have experienced something similar. But when you share your story, you have people come up to you and say, thank you for saying that. This happened to me, or I can relate to you on this level. And it's turning that mess into a message that is blessing and helping other people. And that's so important. And it's just a way that God redeems things. And it's a beautiful part of the journey. Okay, so part 3 of your book is The Road to Healing. And you shared earlier, Cathy, that this has been a pilgrimage. It's taken a long time, but it's okay. And it's just part of our walk with God, really, and even though it's difficult, like I said earlier, it's better than staying stuck, because people can stay stuck for 20, 30, 40, 50 years instead of being
Absolutely.
on that journey or pilgrimage. So what would you say were some of the key elements in the healing process for you?
Well, in my book, I lay out the 6 attributes that I used in my healing pilgrimage. And what I would want people to know is, for myself, um, each of those attributes were critical. And some were easier for me, and
Mhm.
some were a lot harder. I start with the ones that were easier for me, like keeping a good perspective
Yes.
and building more resilience. I mean, yes, we become strong or build more resilience when something happens to us and we persevere. Yet, what I also want people to know is, if you have a negative perspective,
Mhm.
it actually tears down resilience. So some people can go through a lot of bad things and not necessarily build resilience with a negative perspective. So all the attributes I talk about connect piece by piece and touch each other,
Right.
just like a piece of kintsugi. And the
Right.
attributes acted for myself as the lacquer of
Mhm.
silver and gold, making me stronger. Gratitude was one that
Yes.
was not super hard for me, but again, I had to adapt it. I had to keep building it. The last 3 that I talk about were by far the hardest, and by far took me the longest. And that's self-compassion, faith, and forgiveness.
Mhm.
And self-compassion was hard because I had 0. I had absolutely none. And that, unfortunately, is common when people suffer abuse, especially sexual abuse, because the shame is so immense.
Mhm.
It's almost impossible to have self-love.
Mm.
And
Wow.
so that was a process that took me a lot of time. It took a choice, it took awareness, and it took a mindset.
Yeah.
And I had to make the choice that I had to stop bullying myself
Mhm.
with my thoughts and my self conversations,
Mm.
and step into loving myself in the same way that I would love my best friend.
Okay.
And I think so many of us, even if you haven't gone through abuse, we're harder on ourselves, and we say things to ourselves
Yes.
that we
Oh,
would
yeah.
never say to our best friend. I'm too fat, I'm too thin, I'm not smart enough, I'm not this, I can't do this, or I can't do that, I'm not blank enough. Whatever that
Mhm.
blank is, we say that.
Right.
Well, my encouragement to someone else is flip the conversation. If your very best friend walked in the door
Mhm.
and they just said the negative thing that you just said to yourself, how would you reply to them?
Mm.
That is how we need to apply those words to ourselves, because those words matter. And the more we can apply the self-compassion, the more we diminish and get rid of the shame.
Yeah.
And that's so critical in any healing process.
Oh, for sure.
And my faith, as I told you, my faith was not easy. It was hard. It took time. It took studying people, studying scripture.
Right.
I went on an Emmaus walk, which
Mhm.
was a true blessing. But what I can tell anyone, no matter where you're at on your spiritual journey, that my faith grew to a point of me learning the importance of self-compassion to myself
Mhm.
and compassion to others. So love.
Mhm.
So the greatest takeaway for me was love and leaning into the divine power of knowing that it's there for me to lean into,
Right.
and I can grow strength from that. And within my faith journey, my prayer became my means to talk to God.
Mm.
Yet my meditation became my means to listen to
Mm.
God,
That's good.
the quiet time. And the gift within my faith is and I don't believe I would have gotten there without it. I really don't, but it then allowed me to remotely consider forgiveness.
Yes.
Because otherwise I didn't want to. Why should I? Why
Right.
in the world should I forgive someone who stripped me of my childhood innocence? Why should I give anyone who did that to me? But I leaned into it, I walked it, and I got there because I pulled really hard on empathy, knowing that something had to have happened to him to make him do that to me. It didn't excuse it, it
Right.
didn't condone it, and it doesn't mean anyone should never prosecute. It
Right.
just allowed me to consider
Mm.
forgiveness.
That's good. In part of your book, Cathy, you talked about that piece of forgiveness. And you said, if you don't forgive, you're still allowing him to hurt you. And he's not even alive anymore. Right? That was so incredibly powerful. I talk a little bit about that because I feel like that is really going to help somebody because it is hard to forgive. And like I said, it doesn't make it right. We're not excusing people. But if you don't forgive, you're letting that person still wound you.
Well, you are, because they have power over you. What
Yeah.
happens to you has power over you because the anger and the resentment is there.
Mm.
And we hang on to that. And when that anger and resentment is still there because of what happened to you, it holds power over us.
Mhm.
They have, it's kind of like a quote I give in my book: anger and resentment is like drinking poison,
Right.
but we expect the other person to die.
Mhm.
So think about that. If we let that sink in, wait, what? That anger and resentment that I have is hurting me, not him,
Yeah.
me. They're going about living their life or not, but it's power over me. And when I can release that anger, I can release that resentment. I now have my power back.
Yes.
I can now let my light shine the way it's supposed to, because the incident that happened no longer has the power that it had, which is another reason why it's so important to move through and then out. We feel the pain. It hurts. Quite frankly, it
Mhm.
sucks. But when we let it go and we move through it, it's like taking away the key to the prison that we were in. You
Yes.
just
Amen.
unlocked yourself out of that prison, and now you're free to live your life the way you were called and meant to live.
That's good. One of the things you mentioned in the book, Cathy, is you talked about deciding that you're not a victim. And I think that that mindset is so important when we lose that victim mentality. And that really connects to the faith piece, because God causes us to triumph in Christ. So if we are connected to God, we're going to win. He causes us to triumph, and we don't have to be connected to that victim mindset anymore. And I really think that victim mindset keeps people stuck.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because, and again, it comes back to choices. A lot of what I talk about, we have that choice. Where do we want to be in life? And I reached that point of when I was pregnant with my son, I don't want to be a victim mom. I don't
Good.
want to be a victim to my relationships, to my marriage, to my work, my business. I don't want to keep carrying the baggage
Yes.
that we carry as victims. We carry that baggage of that shame, that hurt, that anger, and it weighs us down. And when we can drop that bag and let that go, but it requires the choice to, okay, now I don't want to be a victim. I want to thrive.
Right.
I want to make this choice. I'm going to look at myself as a survivor, but now I want to thrive. I want to have a good life. I want to find joy. I want to find happiness. I want to find the peace that I'm meant to have, that I deserve to have. But that requires stepping out and making the choice of, I no longer want to be in the victim mindset.
Yes, that's so good. And I really feel like that's going to benefit people who are watching today. Well, Cathy, I have about 8 pages of notes here. We're not going to get through everything, but I really encourage our listeners to get the book, because it's just so good. And you've done so much research. And again, this can help people on their journey. It doesn't have to take so long because you have done so much of the legwork for them. But I want to make sure that we get to this part that I've been alluding to about what parents can do to help protect their kids, because we're going back to that statistic of 90% of the abusers are someone the child knows and trusts. And that is causing my alarms to go off just for my own grandchildren. Okay, so let's talk about the steps we can take. And they're so simple. They really are, but I'm glad you laid it out. Okay, number one, you talked about not burying the secrets, okay, or not keeping secrets. And you talked earlier about the difference between a surprise and a secret, right? And that's so good. And what was the quote that you said earlier about something about our secrets? I can't remember what you said before we started recording today. You talked about something about how the perpetrators want to keep everything in secret, and how they kind of gain access through keeping it a secret, and the shame and everything involved in that.
Absolutely. Abuse survives and thrives in silence.
Right.
Perpetrators love secrets, shame, and humiliation, and they continue to abuse. Another quote that I give is 70% of perpetrators have 1 to 9 victims.
Wow.
Hear that. 1 to 9. So what does that mean? A, we got to talk about it. B, we have to respond. We have to prosecute. We have to investigate. We have to believe. So they can't get to 9. We need it to stop at 1. Right. And that happens with us as parents, as a community, as a society, by taking actions and teaching our children the difference between secrets and surprises. And it's okay to say that. Body boundaries. Teach our children body boundaries, and continue the conversation as the vulnerabilities continue, because when they become being alone with adults or other people their age, they're more vulnerable. So it is so critical we continue the conversation. And unfortunately, the abuse statistics go way up in college. So it's so important to continue those conversations and teach our children. And one of the ones that you and I talked about earlier is super simple, is if you're at a family get together, and Uncle John, I'm just throwing that name out there, nothing against John, but Uncle John says, hey, come on, come give me a hug. I want to hug you, a hug and a kiss. Yes. And the child stands behind your leg because they're uncomfortable. Do not force the hug. I watch so many parents still do that today. Go on, go give him a hug and a kiss.
Right.
What we just taught our children is that they do not have body autonomy. We just taught them that they have to do, please hear this, they have to do forced affection.
Wow.
And that is not what we want to teach our children, not if we want to protect them and create the ability to say no. They deserve the ability to say no to a hug to Aunt, Uncle Johnny, even though that may be completely innocent.
Right.
They have to be taught the ability to say no.
Yes.
Now, if they go running to Uncle Johnny and give him a hug, that's okay because they made the choice.
Yes.
They made the choice because they wanted to. And that's important.
That's good. And yes, that's just an easy thing that we can do. And that is so helpful. Okay. Another one is we go out, we're going out on a dinner date. We have a babysitter and we tell our kids, do exactly what the babysitter tells you, right?
Yes.
That's a big no-no.
Big no-no, big no-no. I even did it with my kids early on because I didn't know any better and I didn't know any different. But when you look at the statistics, and this is not me scaring parents out there that think that a babysitter is a perpetrator, but again, they have access to your child. So teaching them to respect the babysitter, but do not say, do whatever they say. Please do not. We don't want to ever say that because then again, we're forcing them to do whatever an adult or someone older than them says. And even if it's not something from the babysitter, it could be an aunt, an uncle, it could be a coach, it could be a pastor, it could be anybody else that has contact to your child. So it is so important to teach that respect, but if you feel uncomfortable, say no.
Yes, absolutely. That's so good. One of the things that you brought up in this section of the book was tickling. And tickling, it can cross a boundary. It can get too extreme.
Absolutely. And please let me be clear. This is not me telling parents, don't ever tickle your children. And I'm not saying you can't do that. That's a bond that a parent can have with their child. Here's the important part. If the child says, no, stop, stop. Please, please, please stop. Don't go beyond for even a half of a second, half of a millisecond. They need to be taught and know that when they say stop and when they say no, even if it's something good, we stop. We respect that boundary. So when we teach them body boundaries, we're also teaching them they have verbal boundaries. They have the ability to say stop and no, and we need to teach them by respecting that.
That's so good. Well, Cathy, there are just so many things that we can talk about, but I really, really appreciate you being our guest today. I appreciate you sharing your story because, like you said, it is going to help people. And there is that courage that it takes to write your story and to share it out with the world. But I'm sure that you're seeing a lot of fruit from that, a lot of people who are helped from you doing that. And people need to know that they're not alone and that God can redeem their story and bring healing and bring that message out of a mess. I want to close today with something that you wrote in the book. You said it's time to break the silence. It's time for uncomfortable conversations. It's time to start eliminating the statistics. It's time to go from broken to beautifully whole. So if you would just once again, hold up your book. I just absolutely love that metaphor of the repair and that it's stronger than it was at the beginning. So thank you, Cathy, for being our guest today.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it's an honor and I so appreciate the time and the space. And I just want people to know that hope and healing absolutely is possible.
I agree with you 100%. So thank you so much. And I want to thank our audience for watching this episode of Voices of Recovery. We're creating a safe place where people can go on their journey with God. If you're new, please give us a like or follow. And please share this message out, because I'm sure there's someone you know who needs to hear what Cathy had to say today. So God bless you, Cathy. Thank you again. And thank you for watching. And we'll see you next time on Voices of Recovery. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.